My name is Amira, and 5 years ago, I was sold like an animal in a marketplace. Today, I stand before you as a daughter of the King of Kings. This is my story of how Jesus Christ reached into the darkest pit of human trafficking and pulled me into his marvelous light. I was born Muslim. I died Muslim. But I was reborn Christian. But let me take you back to where it all began, because the truth is, my story didn't start in that marketplace. It started in a small village where the call to prayer echoed 5 times a day, where my mother's gentle hands taught me to fold prayer rugs, and where I believed with every fiber of my being that Allah was watching over me. You see, I wasn't just another girl who got trafficked. I was the daughter who memorized more Quranic verses than her brothers. I was the child who never missed a prayer, who fasted even when my stomach cramped with hunger during Ramadan, who wore my hijab with pride because I thought it made me beautiful in Allah's eyes. I was devout. I was faithful. I was protected by my religion, or so I thought. What I'm about to share with you will challenge everything you think you know about faith, about protection, about the power of darkness, and about the even greater power of light. Because when I was 15 years old, everything I believed about God, about safety, about family, about my own identity, was shattered in ways I never could have imagined. The very people I trusted most, the faith I clung to, the prayers I whispered in desperation, none of it prepared me for what was coming. And what was coming wasn't just tragedy. It wasn't just betrayal. It was something that would strip away every layer of who I thought I was, until I was left with nothing but questions that my Islamic faith couldn't answer, and a hunger for truth that would lead me to places I never expected to go. This isn't just a story about human trafficking, though that's part of it. This isn't just a story about religious conversion, though that happened too. This is a story about a God I didn't even know existed, who was orchestrating events in my life long before I ever called his name. This is about how the same God who allowed me to be sold like merchandise was the same God who had already set in motion my rescue. How the faith that failed me in my darkest hour was replaced by a faith that literally moved heaven and earth to find me. I'm going to tell you things that happened to me that will make you uncomfortable. I'm going to share moments of such darkness that you might want to look away. But I'm also going to show you light breaking through in ways that will leave you breathless, because the God I serve now doesn't just save, he redeems. He doesn't just rescue, he restores. And he doesn't just forgive, he transforms. So settle in, because this journey I'm about to take you on will challenge your assumptions about religion, about suffering, about justice, and about love. By the time I'm done, you'll understand why I can stand here today and say with absolute certainty that the worst thing that ever happened to me was also the pathway to the best thing that ever happened to me. My name is Amira. This is my testimony. And it begins in Syria, in a house where the Quran was our guide, where modesty was our virtue, and where we never imagined that evil could disguise itself as opportunity. Picture this. A dusty village 30 kilometers outside Damascus, where donkeys still carried water jugs and where the ancient stone houses seemed to hold secrets from centuries past. This was my world. The world of Amira Hassan al-Rashid. My father, Ahmad, wasn't just any Muslim man. He was the muezzin of our village mosque, the one whose voice called the faithful to prayer 5 times a day. His voice could be heard from every corner of our small community, rich and melodious, carrying the sacred words across the morning mist and evening shadows. But what you need to understand about my father is this. He didn't just call others to prayer. He lived it. Every movement of his day was choreographed around those 5 prayer times. Far before dawn, Dur at midday, Asr in the afternoon, Maghrib at sunset, and Isha after dark. Our entire family's rhythm pulsed to this sacred heartbeat. My mother, Fatima, was the kind of woman other village women looked up to. Her hijab was always perfectly draped, never a strand of hair visible. Her prayers were whispered with such devotion that I used to think Allah must lean down from heaven just to hear her. She bore my father's 6 children, and I was the youngest, the only daughter after 5 sons. My brothers, Hassan, Omar, Khalid, Mustafa, and Yusuf, they were my protectors, my playmates, my heroes. In our culture, Being the only sister meant being treasured, being guarded, being loved in ways that Western minds might find overwhelming. They called me our little pearl, and I believed that's exactly what I was. Now, I need you to understand something crucial about my faith. This wasn't casual religion. This wasn't going to mosque on Fridays and forgetting about God the rest of the week. Islam was woven into every breath I took, every thought I had, every dream I dreamed. I learned to read Arabic before I could properly read in my native tongue. The Quran wasn't just a book in our house, it was the book. By the time I was 12, I had memorized over 50 surahs. I could recite the entire opening chapter, Al-Fatiha, in my sleep. My parents would bring visitors just to hear their daughter recite, their faces glowing with pride. I prayed 5 times a day from the age of 7. Not because I was forced to, but because I wanted to. I wanted to please Allah. I wanted to be His faithful servant. During Ramadan, I fasted even when my mother said I was too young because I believed that sacrifice brought me closer to the divine. But here's what I didn't tell anyone, what I couldn't tell anyone. Even with all that devotion, all those prayers, all that memorization, I felt distant from Allah. I performed the rituals perfectly, but I never felt embraced. I followed the rules flawlessly, but I never felt loved. There was always this sense that Allah was watching, judging, weighing my deeds, but never holding me. I thought this was normal. I thought faith was supposed to feel like standing before a stern judge rather than resting in a father's arms. I thought the fear I felt was reverence, the distance I experienced was respect, the emptiness I sometimes felt was just how it was supposed to be. To the outside world, we were the model Muslim family. My father was respected throughout the region for his knowledge of Islamic jurisprudence. My mother was sought out by young wives for advice on running a godly household. My brothers were known for their integrity in business and their faithfulness in prayer. Our home was always filled with the smell of my mother's cooking, lamb with rice, fresh bread, strong tea sweetened with honey. Every evening after Maghrib prayer, we would gather as a family. My father would read from the Quran while my mother served tea. My brothers would share stories from their day, and I would sit quietly, absorbing every word, feeling safe in the cocoon of family love. But even in that safety, there were things I noticed that I didn't understand then. The way my mother's smile would sometimes fade when she thought no one was looking. The way my father's voice would carry just a hint of worry when he spoke with other men after prayer. The way my oldest brother Hassan would stare out the window with an expression I couldn't quite read. There were visitors who came to our house late at night, men who spoke in hushed voices with my father. I would listen from my bedroom, catching fragments of conversations about opportunities and difficult times and what must be done. I didn't understand then that these conversations would change the trajectory of my entire life. The war in Syria hadn't reached our village directly, but its effects were creeping in like flood water seeping under doors. The textile factory where my father worked part-time began cutting hours. The markets where my mother shopped started charging prices that made her count coins twice before purchasing anything. My brothers, one by one, began talking about leaving. Not permanently, they assured us, just temporarily, just to find work in Turkey or Lebanon or anywhere the war hadn't made jobs disappear like morning mist. Hassan left first, then Omar, then Khalid. Each departure felt like a small death in our household. I started noticing my mother's prayers getting longer, more desperate. Instead of the quiet, confident supplications I was used to hearing, her voice began carrying an edge of pleading that made something cold settle in my stomach. She would pray for provision, for protection, for her sons far from home, for solutions to problems she wouldn't name out loud. And my father, the man whose voice had always been strong and steady as he called the faithful to prayer, began to sound strained. The confidence that had marked his recitation of Islamic teachings gave way to something that sounded almost like questioning, as if he were asking Allah questions instead of simply praising him. That's when Uncle Rashid started visiting more frequently. Uncle Rashid, who wasn't really our uncle, but whom we'd called Uncle since childhood. Uncle Rashid, who always seemed to have money when others didn't, who always seemed to know about opportunities when others saw only obstacles. Uncle Rashid, whose smile never quite reached his eyes, though I didn't recognize that warning sign at the time. I was 15, still believing that Allah would protect our family, still trusting that my parents would never let harm come to their precious daughter, still assuming that being a faithful Muslim girl was all the armor I needed against the darkness of this world. I had no idea that evil doesn't announce itself with horns and pitchforks. I had no idea that sometimes the most dangerous predators come disguised as family friends, as solutions to desperate problems, as answers to prayers that should never have been prayed. I had no idea that in just a few weeks, everything I believed about safety, about family, about faith, about God Himself, would be tested in ways that would either destroy me completely or transform me into someone I never dreamed I could become. It was a Tuesday evening when Uncle Rashid came with his proposal. I remember the date because it was the day that changed everything. My father had just finished the Maghrib prayer, and my mother was preparing dinner when we heard his familiar knock at our door. But this time was different. This time, he carried himself with the urgency of a man bearing solutions. He sat in our living room, accepting the customary tea, but his manner was more serious than usual. He spoke quietly with my parents while I helped my mother in the kitchen, but I could hear fragments of their conversation. He mentioned a wealthy family in Beirut, Lebanese Christians who needed help with their children. He spoke of good wages, respectable work, and the opportunity for a young woman to learn skills that would serve her well in marriage. My parents exchanged glances that I didn't understand at the time. My mother's hands trembled slightly as she served more tea. My father stroked his beard, a habit he had when deep in thought. And Uncle Rashid continued painting his picture of opportunity, describing how many young women from struggling families had found prosperity through such arrangements. The conversation continued for hours. I was sent to my room, but I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear every word. They discussed my education, my character, my devotion to Islam. Uncle Rashid assured them that the family was respectful of Muslim beliefs, that I would be allowed to maintain my prayers and my modest dress. He spoke of monthly wages that would feed our family for months. When I finally fell asleep that night, I had no idea that my parents had just agreed to send their youngest daughter away with a man whose true intentions were as dark as the Syrian night outside our windows. The next morning brought a flurry of activity. My mother began preparing my clothes, selecting my most modest dresses, and ensuring my hijabs were clean and pressed. She packed my small Quran, the one my grandmother had given me when I learned to read Arabic. She included prayer beads that had belonged to her mother, as if these sacred objects could protect me wherever I was going. My father sat me down and explained that I would be traveling to Lebanon to work for a good family. He spoke of the honor of representing our family well, of the importance of maintaining my Islamic values even in a Christian household. He made me promise to pray 5 times a day, to read my Quran daily, and to remember that I was a daughter of Islam wherever I went. I was excited. The prospect of travel, of seeing beyond our small village, of earning money to help my family, filled me with anticipation. I imagined the Christian family I would work for, wondering if they would be kind, if their children would be well-behaved, if I would learn to speak better Arabic or perhaps even some French. My mother cried when she packed my belongings, but I thought it was simply because she would miss me. I had no understanding of the true reason for her tears, no comprehension of the sacrifice she believed she was making for our family's survival. 3 days later, Uncle Rashid returned with a car and a driver I had never seen before. The driver was a thin man with nervous eyes who spoke little and avoided looking directly at any of us. Uncle Rashid was unusually hurried, urging us to move quickly because they had a long journey ahead and wanted to cross the border before evening. My family gathered to say goodbye. My father recited verses from the Quran over me, asking Allah to protect me and guide me. My mother held me close, whispering prayers in my ear and making me promise to write letters home. If Mustafa and Yusuf, my 2 remaining brothers, had been home from work, they might have asked more questions about this sudden departure, but they were away, and the goodbye was rushed. I climbed into the back seat of the car with my small suitcase and my heart full of excitement and nervousness. Uncle Rashid sat in the front with the driver, occasionally turning to reassure me about the wonderful opportunity ahead. As we drove away from my village, I watched my family grow smaller through the rear window until they disappeared entirely. The drive took hours. We passed through checkpoints where Uncle Rashid showed papers and spoke with soldiers in low voices. I dozed fitfully in the back seat, waking occasionally to see unfamiliar landscapes passing by the window. The driver chain-smoked cigarettes and spoke occasionally with Uncle Rashid in a dialect I didn't recognize. As evening approached, we stopped at a house that Uncle Rashid said belonged to a friend who would provide us shelter for the night before we completed our journey to Beirut. The house was larger than ours, but felt cold and unwelcoming. There were several men there who looked at me in ways that made me uncomfortable, though I couldn't articulate why. That night, sleeping in a strange room on an unfamiliar bed, I whispered my evening prayers with extra fervor, asking Allah to watch over me and to help me serve this new family well. I recited verses from the Quran that my mother had taught me for protection, believing that my faith would shield me from any harm. I had no way of knowing that this was the last night I would pray as a free person. I had no understanding that the men in the next room were already discussing my sale, negotiating my price, planning my future in ways that would strip away every shred of dignity and innocence I possessed. When morning came, Uncle Rashid woke me early and said we needed to leave immediately. There was no breakfast, only urgency, and the promise that we would eat once we reached our destination. I gathered my few belongings and climbed back into the car, still trusting, still believing in the opportunity that had been described to my parents. But instead of driving toward Beirut, we took roads that led deeper into unfamiliar territory. When I asked about our destination, Uncle Rashid told me there had been a change of plans, that we needed to meet the family at a different location. The driver's behavior became more erratic, and I began to feel the first stirrings of genuine fear. We arrived at a compound surrounded by high walls and guarded gates. This was not the Christian family home I had imagined. This was something else entirely, something that made my stomach twist with dread even before I understood what it was. Uncle Rashid helped me out of the car and walked me toward a building that looked more like a prison than a home. Other men appeared, men who looked at me the way buyers examine livestock. And in that moment, as the reality of my situation began to dawn on me, I realized that everything I had believed about my journey, everything my parents had been told, everything I had hoped for, was a lie. I was not going to work for a kind Christian family. I was not going to earn wages to send home to my parents. I was not going to return home with stories of adventure and independence. I was merchandise that had been sold, a commodity that had been purchased, a human being who had just become property. The men spoke about me in terms I didn't fully understand, discussing my age, my appearance, my potential value in markets I had never heard of. Uncle Rashid collected money from one of them, counted it carefully, and prepared to leave without me. When I tried to follow him, to beg him to take me home, he avoided my eyes and told me I needed to be obedient to my new employers. As his car disappeared through the compound gates, I stood alone among strangers who saw me not as Amira, the devout Muslim girl who loved her family and dreamed of serving Allah faithfully, but as a product to be processed, prepared, and sold to the highest bidder. That first night in captivity, I prayed harder than I had ever prayed in my life. I recited every verse I knew, begged Allah for rescue, promised greater devotion if He would only deliver me from this place. I cried out to the God I had served faithfully since childhood, the God my father proclaimed 5 times a day, the God my mother had taught me to trust completely. But the heavens remained silent. No angel appeared to unlock my chains. No divine intervention came to lead me home. The prayers I whispered into the darkness seemed to evaporate into nothingness, leaving me more alone than I had ever felt in my 15 years of life. The other girls in the compound came from different backgrounds. Some were Christian, some Muslim, some from religions I had never heard of. But none of our gods seemed to hear our cries. None of our faiths seemed powerful enough to break the chains that bound us. We were all equally abandoned, equally forgotten, equally worthless in the eyes of the men who controlled our lives. They moved me from that compound after a week. I was transported like cargo, hidden in the back of a truck with several other girls, all of us heading toward destinations we couldn't imagine. Some girls whispered rumors about what happened to those who were sold, but I refused to believe their stories. I clung to the hope that this was all a terrible mistake, that somehow my parents would find me, that Uncle Rashid would realize his error and come to take me home. The marketplace where I was finally sold was unlike anything I had ever seen. It was underground, hidden from the world above, filled with people buying and selling human beings as casually as they might purchase vegetables or livestock. I was displayed alongside dozens of other girls and young women, each of us tagged with information about our age, origin, and selling points. Men examined us with clinical detachment, discussing our potential uses, our likely durability, our resistance to their plans. They spoke in languages I didn't understand, but their intentions were clear even without words. Some girls were purchased quickly, while others waited days for buyers. I spent 3 days in that market, 3 days that felt like 3 years. During those days, I prayed constantly. I begged Allah to blind the eyes of potential buyers, to make me invisible, to strike down the men who trafficked in human flesh. I promised to memorize the entire Quran if he would rescue me. I vowed to fast every Monday and Thursday for the rest of my life if he would deliver me. I swore to dedicate my entire existence to his service if he would just let me go home. But my prayers seemed to bounce off the ceiling of that underground hell and fall back down on me like stones. Allah felt farther away than ever, more distant than the stars, more unreachable than my family back in Syria. The faith that had shaped my entire identity seemed powerless against the evil that surrounded me. When I was finally purchased, it was by a man whose eyes held no trace of human compassion. He examined me like a farmer inspecting a potential draft animal, checking my teeth, my hands, my general health. He negotiated my price with the same emotion he might use to buy a piece of furniture. I ceased to be Amira in that moment and became simply an acquisition, an investment, a tool for generating profit. My first owner took me to a house where I learned the true meaning of captivity. The work I was forced to do had nothing to do with caring for children or maintaining a household. Instead, I became a slave in the most literal and horrific sense of the word, forced to provide services that violated everything I had been taught about dignity, modesty, and the sacred nature of the human body. I tried to maintain my Islamic practices in that place of darkness. I attempted to pray 5 times a day, though my captors mocked my devotion and sometimes prevented me from following my religious obligations. I whispered verses from the Quran when I thought no one could hear, hoping that the sacred words might provide some protection or comfort. But even my religious practices began to feel hollow. The prayers that had once connected me to something greater than myself now seemed like empty words echoing in an empty universe. The Quranic verses that had once filled me with peace now reminded me of a God who seemed either unable or unwilling to help his faithful servant. I spent 8 months with that first owner before he sold me to someone else. During those months, I experienced degradations that I cannot fully describe, violations that stripped away not just my physical freedom but my sense of self-worth, my belief in human goodness, my faith in divine justice. My second owner was worse than the first. He was creative in his cruelty, finding new ways to break down any resistance I might still possess. He seemed to take particular pleasure in mocking my Islamic faith, forcing me to eat pork, preventing me from washing before prayers, and defiling the few religious articles I had managed to keep from home. Under his control, I stopped praying altogether. Not because he prevented me, but because I no longer believed anyone was listening. The Allah I had worshipped since childhood seemed either non-existent or indifferent to my suffering. The Islamic faith that had provided structure and meaning to my life felt like a cruel joke in the face of such overwhelming evil. It was during my time with the second owner that I met Miriam. She was an older woman, probably in her 50s, who worked as a maid in the house. Unlike everyone else in that place, she showed me small kindnesses, an extra piece of bread when the owner wasn't looking, a gentle word when I was crying, a wet cloth to clean my wounds after particularly brutal encounters. Miriam was different from anyone I had ever met. She carried herself with a quiet dignity that seemed untouchable despite the circumstances we lived in. She worked efficiently and without complaint, but there was something in her eyes that suggested an inner strength that no amount of abuse could break. I learned that Miriam was a Christian, a follower of Jesus. In my Islamic upbringing, I had been taught that Christians were people of the book, followers of an earlier revelation who had unfortunately strayed from the true path that culminated in Islam. I respected them as fellow believers in one God, but I had always pitied them for missing the final and perfect revelation brought by the Prophet Muhammad. But watching Miriam, I began to see something in her faith that was different from anything I had experienced in Islam. She didn't just follow religious rules or perform ritual obligations. She seemed to have a personal relationship with her God, talking to him throughout the day as if he were present with her, listening to her words, caring about her struggles. Late at night, when the house was quiet and our owner was occupied elsewhere, Miriam would sometimes share stories with me about her Jesus. She told me about a God who had become human, who had experienced suffering and rejection, who understood what it felt like to be abandoned and abused. This concept was revolutionary to me. In Islam, Allah is transcendent, far above human experience, untouchable by the pain and struggle of mortal life. The idea that God might actually understand suffering from the inside, might have experienced betrayal and abandonment personally, was unlike anything I had ever considered. Miriam told me about Jesus healing the sick, comforting the brokenhearted, defending women who had been rejected by society. She described a God who didn't demand perfect religious performance, but who offered love and acceptance to those who had been discarded by everyone else. I found myself hungry for these stories in ways I couldn't explain. My Islamic faith had emphasized submission to Allah's will, acceptance of whatever came as part of his divine plan. But Miriam's Jesus seemed to offer something different, not just resignation to suffering, but hope for genuine rescue, not just endurance of pain, but actual healing. One night, after a particularly horrible day, I found myself crying uncontrollably in the small room where I was kept. Miriam heard my sobs and came to sit beside me. Instead of offering empty comfort or religious platitudes, she asked if she could pray for me. I had heard Christians pray before, but always from a distance, always as an outsider observing strange rituals. But when Miriam prayed for me that night, it was unlike anything I had ever experienced. She didn't recite memorized verses or follow prescribed formulas. Instead, she talked to Jesus as if he were sitting right there with us, as if he could see my tears and understand my pain. She prayed for healing of my body and soul. She asked Jesus to comfort me in ways that went beyond human comfort. She requested protection from further harm and hope for genuine freedom. But most remarkably, she prayed as if she truly believed that Jesus cared about what happened to me personally, that he knew my name, that he was grieved by my suffering. As I listened to her pray, something began to shift inside me. It wasn't a dramatic conversion or a sudden flash of understanding. It was more like a tiny crack appearing in a wall that had been building around my heart since my capture. For the first time in months, I felt a small stirring of something that might have been hope. Over the following weeks, I found myself asking Miriam more questions about her faith. I wanted to understand how she maintained such peace in the midst of circumstances that had destroyed my own faith. I was curious about this Jesus who seemed so different from the distant Allah I had worshipped all my life. Miriam was patient with my questions, never pushing her beliefs on me, but always willing to share when I asked. She explained that Jesus had come to earth not as a conquering king or a demanding judge, but as a servant who gave his life to rescue people who were trapped in hopeless situations. She told me about Jesus dying on a cross, taking upon himself the punishment for every evil thing that had ever been done, including the evil that was being done to me. This concept of substitutionary sacrifice was foreign to my Islamic understanding, where each person was responsible for their own deeds and their own relationship with Allah. But the idea that someone might willingly suffer in order to free others from suffering resonated with something deep in my spirit. The Jesus that Miriam described was not a distant deity observing human struggle from afar, but a God who had entered into human struggle personally, who had experienced the worst that evil could inflict, who had triumphed over that evil through love rather than force. As our conversations continued, I began to see the fundamental difference between the faith I had grown up with and the faith that sustained Miriam. Islam had taught me to submit to Allah's will, even when that will seem to include terrible suffering. Christianity, as Miriam explained it, offered the possibility that God's will was actually for human flourishing, that suffering was not part of his plan but something he was actively working to overcome. 6 months after meeting Miriam, my second owner sold me again. This time, I was purchased by a man who owned several properties and moved his human possessions between them based on demand and profit potential. I was separated from Miriam, but the seed she had planted in my heart continued to grow. My third owner was perhaps the most brutal of all. He specialized in breaking the spirits of girls who still showed signs of resistance or hope. His methods were designed not just to ensure compliance, but to destroy any sense of self-worth or possibility of escape. It was under his control that I reached the lowest point of my captivity. He succeeded in convincing me that I was worthless, that no one would ever want me back, that I deserved everything that was happening to me. He made me believe that I was permanently stained, permanently damaged, permanently unworthy of love or respect. But even in that darkness, I found myself remembering things that Miriam had told me about Jesus. She had said that he came specifically for people who were broken, that he specialized in restoring those whom society had discarded. She had insisted that no amount of abuse or degradation could change how much God loved someone. These thoughts provided tiny sparks of light in an otherwise overwhelming darkness. I didn't have enough faith to pray to Jesus yet, but I clung to the possibility that Miriam might be right, that there might be a God who saw value in someone like me even when I could see none in myself. The breaking point came during my 4th month with the third owner. He had arranged something particularly degrading, something that pushed me beyond my ability to endure. As I lay in my small room afterward, feeling more dead than alive, I realized that I had 2 choices. I could surrender completely to despair, or I could take a step toward the hope that Miriam had offered. In that moment, with nothing left to lose and no other options remaining, I whispered my first prayer to Jesus. It wasn't eloquent or theologically sophisticated. I simply said, Jesus, if you're real, if you really care about broken people like Miriam said, please help me. I don't know how to believe in you, but I want to try. Nothing dramatic happened immediately. There were no angels, no miraculous interventions, no sudden changes in my circumstances. But something subtle began to shift in my heart. The crushing weight of despair that had been suffocating me for months began to lift just slightly, like a small window opening in a room that had been sealed shut. Over the following days, I found myself praying to Jesus more frequently. I told him about my pain, my fear, my hopelessness. I shared with him the shame I felt about what had been done to me and what I had been forced to do. I asked him to help me understand if Miriam was right about his love for broken people. Gradually, I began to sense a presence with me that I had never experienced before. It wasn't the distant, judgmental presence I had associated with Allah. This felt more like what Miriam had described, a loving father sitting with a wounded daughter, offering comfort without condemnation, providing strength without demands. 3 weeks after that first desperate prayer, something extraordinary happened. Police raided the compound where I was being held. Later, I learned that the raid was the result of months of investigation, surveillance, and careful planning. But in that moment, as officers broke down doors and arrested my captors, it felt like a direct answer to prayer. I was taken to a safe house run by Christian aid workers. For the first time in over 2 years, I was safe, free, surrounded by people who saw me as a human being rather than a commodity. The contrast was so overwhelming that I spent the first 3 days simply crying, not from sadness, but from relief and gratitude. At the safe house, I met Pastor David, a man who had become like the father I had lost when I was taken from my family. Pastor David was gentle and patient, never pushing me to talk about my experiences before I was ready, always available when I needed someone to listen. It was Pastor David who helped me understand what had happened to me spiritually during my captivity. He explained that my experience with Jesus wasn't just psychological comfort or wishful thinking. It was a genuine encounter with the living God who had heard my desperate prayer and responded with rescue. Pastor David taught me about the gospel, the good news that Jesus Christ had come to earth specifically to rescue people who were trapped in hopeless situations. He showed me Bible verses that described Jesus seeking out the lost, healing the broken, and offering freedom to captives. For the first time, I understood that my rescue wasn't just a fortunate coincidence or the result of good police work. It was the answer to prayer, the fulfillment of God's promise to deliver those who call upon His name. The Jesus that Miriam had told me about had proven himself real in the most concrete way possible. As I learned more about Christianity, I began to see how different it was from the Islam I had grown up with. In Islam, I had been taught to earn Allah's favor through good deeds, religious observance, and submission to His will. In Christianity, I discovered that God's love was offered freely, not as a reward for good behavior, but as a gift to those who recognize their need for rescue. The concept of grace, undeserved favor from God, was revolutionary to someone who had spent her childhood trying to earn divine approval through perfect religious performance. Pastor David explained that Jesus had already done everything necessary to reconcile me to God, that my job was simply to receive the gift of salvation rather than trying to earn it. This understanding transformed my relationship with God completely. Instead of a distant judge who weighed my actions and found me wanting, I discovered a loving Father who had moved heaven and earth to rescue His daughter. Instead of a deity who demanded perfection, I found a Savior who specialized in redeeming broken lives. 3 months after my rescue, I made the decision to be baptized. The symbolism was perfect. Going down into the water represented the death of Amira, the Muslim slave, and coming up represented the birth of Amira, the beloved daughter of Christ. As I went under that water, I felt the weight of my past being washed away. The shame, the guilt, the sense of being permanently damaged, all of it was dissolved in the promise of new life in Jesus. When I came up from the water, I knew that I was no longer defined by what had been done to me, but by what Christ had done for me. The transformation wasn't just spiritual, it was practical. The safe house provided counseling to help me process the trauma I had experienced. They offered education to help me build skills for independent living. They connected me with other survivors who understood what I had been through. But most importantly, they helped me understand my new identity as a daughter of God. I learned that my value didn't depend on my purity, my performance, or my past. I was precious to God simply because He had created me and chosen to love me. As my healing progressed, I felt called to share my story with others. I began speaking at churches, conferences, and events where people needed to hear about the power of God to rescue and restore. I found that my testimony had the ability to reach people who had given up hope, especially women who had experienced abuse or trafficking. I also became involved in anti-trafficking work, using my experience to help identify and rescue other victims. There was something deeply healing about being able to transform my suffering into a tool for helping others escape similar situations. Through this work, I met other survivors who had found hope in Jesus Christ. Some had been trafficked for years, others had escaped quickly but carried deep emotional scars. What united us was not our shared trauma, but our shared experience of divine rescue and restoration. One of the most powerful moments came when I was able to reconnect with Miriam, the Christian woman who had first told me about Jesus. She had been released from her situation shortly after I was moved, and she had spent the intervening time praying for me and working with organizations that fought human trafficking. When we met again, both of us free and serving the same Jesus who had sustained us through our darkest hours, we wept together for joy. Miriam told me that she had never stopped believing that God would rescue me, that she had prayed for me every day since we were separated. Seeing Miriam again reinforced something I had come to understand about God's sovereignty. He had placed her in my life at exactly the moment when I needed to hear about Jesus. He had used her faithfulness to plant seeds that would eventually grow into saving faith. Even in the midst of terrible circumstances, God had been orchestrating events for my ultimate good. But perhaps the most challenging part of my new life was learning to forgive. Pastor David explained that forgiveness wasn't optional for Christians, that Jesus had commanded his followers to forgive those who had wronged them. This seemed impossible when applied to the men who had bought and sold me, who had treated me like property, who had stolen years of my life. The process of forgiveness took months and required divine help that I couldn't generate on my own. Pastor David helped me understand that forgiveness didn't mean excusing what had been done to me or pretending that it wasn't harmful. Instead, it meant releasing my right to revenge and trusting God to handle justice in his own way and time. As I struggled with forgiveness, I began to understand more deeply what Jesus had done for me on the cross. He had forgiven people who were actively torturing him, people who showed no remorse for their actions. If Jesus could forgive his executioners, then surely he could give me the strength to forgive my traffickers. The breakthrough came when I realized that my bitterness was still giving my captors power over me. Even though I was physically free, my refusal to forgive was keeping me emotionally enslaved to the anger and hatred I felt toward them. Forgiveness wasn't just obedience to God's command, it was the final step in my own liberation. One by one, I began to forgive the people who had hurt me. Uncle Rashid, who had betrayed my family's trust. The buyers and sellers in that underground marketplace. Each of my owners who had treated me as less than human. Even my parents, who had made an impossible choice in desperate circumstances. This forgiveness didn't happen overnight, and it didn't mean that I stopped working for justice. I continued to cooperate with law enforcement efforts to prosecute traffickers and rescue victims. But I did so from a place of love for the oppressed rather than hatred for the oppressors. One of the most significant moments came when I was contacted by a woman from my home village in Syria. She had heard about my story through someone and wanted to know if I was the same Amira who had disappeared years earlier. Through this contact, I learned that my family had spent years searching for me. They had reported my disappearance to authorities, had traveled to Lebanon looking for me, had never stopped believing that I might still be alive. My parents had aged dramatically during my absence. My father's voice had lost its strength from calling out to Allah in desperate prayer for my return. The decision to contact my family was one of the most difficult I had ever made. I longed to see them again, to reassure them that I was alive and well. But I also knew that my conversion to Christianity would be devastating to them, that they might reject me entirely when they learned about my new faith. After months of prayer and counseling, I decided to reach out to my family. I wrote a letter explaining that I was alive, that I was safe, and that I wanted to see them again. I tried to prepare them gently for the news that I had become a Christian, emphasizing that my faith had been the source of my rescue and healing. The response was everything I had feared it might be. My father was heartbroken by my conversion, seeing it as a betrayal of everything he had taught me. My mother was torn between joy at my survival and grief over my spiritual condition. My brothers were angry, confused, and unsure how to relate to a sister who had abandoned Islam. But despite their religious objections, they agreed to meet with me. The reunion was bittersweet, overwhelming joy at being together again, but painful tension over my new faith. They begged me to return to Islam, to come home and resume my place in the family. I tried to explain to them what Jesus had done for me, how he had rescued me when all seemed silent, how he had given me new life when I was spiritually dead. I shared how my Christian faith had provided healing and purpose that I had never found in Islam. My family struggled to understand how I could abandon the faith of my childhood, the religion that had shaped our family for generations. They saw my conversion as a rejection of them personally, as ingratitude for the Islamic upbringing they had provided. It broke my heart to see their pain, but I couldn't deny the truth of what Jesus had done in my life. I couldn't pretend that Islam had been sufficient when it was Christianity that had actually saved me. I couldn't return to a faith that had felt distant and demanding when I had found one that was intimate and gracious. Eventually, we reached an understanding. My family couldn't accept my religious choices, but they acknowledged that I was alive and well because of them. They saw the healing and peace in my life, even if they couldn't accept the source of that healing. Today, I continue to maintain contact with my family, though our relationship remains complicated by religious differences. I pray for them daily, asking God to reveal himself to them as he revealed himself to me. I hope that someday they will understand that my conversion wasn't a loss but a gain, not an ending but a beginning. 5 years have passed since my rescue, and I can honestly say that the worst thing that ever happened to me became the pathway to the best thing that ever happened to me. The trafficking was horrific, traumatic, evil in every way. But it was also the circumstance that led me to Jesus, that introduced me to true love, that gave me a purpose worth living for. I don't believe that God caused my trafficking in order to bring about my salvation. Evil is evil, and God grieves over every act of human cruelty and oppression. But I do believe that God was able to use even that terrible experience for good, that he was working all things together for my ultimate benefit and his ultimate glory. Today, I wake up every morning knowing that I am loved unconditionally by the Creator of the universe. I start each day in prayer, not from religious obligation but from genuine relationship with a God who knows me completely and accepts me totally. I serve him not out of fear but out of gratitude for all that he has done for me. My life today bears no resemblance to the life I might have lived if I had never been trafficked. I probably would have married a Muslim man from my village, raised Muslim children, lived and died without ever knowing the Jesus who became my savior. The trafficking was terrible, but it led me to something infinitely more valuable than the life I lost. This doesn't mean I'm grateful for the trafficking itself. I wouldn't wish that experience on anyone, and I work tirelessly to prevent other girls from going through what I went through. But I am grateful for the way God used even that evil circumstance to accomplish his good purposes in my life. I want you to understand that this God I serve, this Jesus who rescued me, is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He is still in the business of rescuing the lost, healing the broken, and giving hope to the hopeless. Whatever circumstance you might be facing, whatever darkness might surround you, whatever hopelessness you might feel, he is able to bring light, healing, and purpose. You might be sitting here today feeling like your life is over, like you've made too many mistakes, like you're too damaged for God to love. I want you to know that's a lie. The same Jesus who reached into a trafficking compound to rescue a broken Muslim girl is reaching toward you right now with the same love, the same power, the same desire to make all things new. You might be struggling with your own faith questions, wondering if God really cares about your suffering, questioning whether he has the power to change your circumstances. I understand those doubts because I've lived them. But I can testify from personal experience that God is real, that he is good, and that he is actively working to rescue and restore everyone who calls upon his name. Your story might not look like mine. Your rescue might not be as dramatic, your transformation might not be as visible. But the same God who saved me wants to save you. The same Jesus who gave me new life wants to give you new life. The same love that healed my wounds wants to heal yours. If you've never given your life to Jesus Christ, if you've never experienced the love and forgiveness that he offers, I want to invite you to take that step today. You don't have to clean up your life first. You don't have to become a better person before approaching him. He accepts you exactly as you are, and he has the power to transform you into who you were meant to be. If you're already a Christian but you're struggling with doubt or despair, I want to remind you that our God specializes in impossible situations. He is not intimidated by your problems or overwhelmed by your circumstances. He is the same God who rescued me from human trafficking, and he is fully capable of handling whatever you're facing. My name is Amira. I was sold as a sex slave, but I was saved by Jesus Christ. My story is a testimony to the power of God to bring beauty from ashes, to create purpose from pain, to generate hope from hopelessness. And if he can do that for me, he can do it for you too. So please, take those simple actions right now. Subscribe, like, comment with your location and how this has impacted you, and share with someone who needs to hear this message. Together, we can ensure that this testimony of God's faithfulness reaches every corner of the earth, bringing hope to the hopeless and freedom to the captive. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for caring about the issues I've shared. Thank you for being part of God's work in the world. May He bless you richly as you continue your own journey with Him. This is my testimony. This is my song. This is my life. And it's all because of Jesus.